because Hamas is the government of Gaza. That's how governments work. They
No,
impose
but hang on,
taxes on goods under their control.
Back up a moment. Where is the proof that that is happening? The UK and 27 other countries have condemned Israel for depriving Palestinians of human dignity in its war in Gaza. The Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, told the House of Commons that Israel is not doing enough to avoid civilian casualties.
The Israeli government must answer what possible military justification can there be for strikes that have killed desperate, starving children? What immediate actions are they taking to stop this litany of horrors?
We will be speaking to the Foreign Secretary live on the programme after 7 o'clock today. His comments came as Israel launched a new ground offensive in the southern city of Deir al-Balah. It's been the main humanitarian hub in the enclave. Liz Alcock from the charity Medical Aid for Palestinians spoke to us from Gaza. The organisation has suspended its operations there. She explains why.
We were given about 6 hours to evacuate our clinic in Deir al-Balah. It provides critical medical services as well as assistance for malnourished children, vaccination services, physiotherapy, mental health support to up to 400 people a day. Every time we think we have hit rock bottom, whether that's mass forced displacement, killing and maiming, we now have an all but total siege, a militarized supply mechanism, the killing of aid seekers in their thousands, and the policy and practice of starvation. And yet here we are again today seeing a new low. The forced evacuation orders of Deir al-Balah, which is an area that houses most UN and international aid agencies, is a location Israel itself designated as so-called humanitarian and safe, once again proving that really no such thing exists.
That was Liz Alcock, the head of humanitarian protection at Medical Aid for Palestinians. Well, listening to that was Eylon Levy, the former Israeli government spokesperson. Good morning.
Good morning, Kate.
What is your response to what you heard there from Liz Alcock?
Yeah, look, first of all, it would be remiss of me not to mention that we just had an attempted ballistic missile attack in Tel Aviv. Just shy of 6 a.m, we had a siren and millions of Israelis ran to shelters because of an incoming ballistic missile from Yemen, which is just a reminder that the war that Hamas launched on the 7th of October 2023 is a regional war by the Iranian regime's proxies. And just because the missile didn't hit anyone, we shouldn't pass by without mentioning it. Look, we're at a very sensitive point in the negotiations right now for a ceasefire. Israel is pushing for a temporary ceasefire that will allow us to get half of the hostages back and create space for diplomacy that will enable us, hopefully, to get all of the hostages back and remove Hamas from power. And I think what Israel is doing now with the offensive in Deir al-Balah is signaling to Hamas that it's time to show some flexibility in the talks and enable us to get to a ceasefire. And if he doesn't, then Israel is willing by itself to continue to progress towards the goals of the war, which are the removal of Hamas from power and the destruction of its remaining military capabilities.
When you say the removal of Hamas from power, how do you envisage achieving that aim ultimately?
Israel's Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer, who is in charge of the negotiations in Qatar, says that Israel's plan now is to get a temporary ceasefire, 60 days, enable us to get half of the living hostages out in a ransom. And that creates space for negotiations. In those 60 days, there is room for talks in which Hamas will agree to relinquish power, lay down its arms, and allow the Gaza Strip to be governed by a force that doesn't want to use it as a launch pad for more attacks against Israel. I think a lot has changed in the wake of the so-called 12-day war with Iran, and there is room now for other countries in the Arab world to come to Hamas and say, look, it's game over. No one wants Hamas to continue governing the Gaza Strip after this war. They need to make clear to Hamas they're not willing to put a penny into reconstruction if they suspect it wants to put it back into its tunnels instead of rebuilding people's homes above ground. But a temporary ceasefire is the first step towards the talks that are necessary to get to some sort of long-term settlement.
Yeah. Many people believe that Israel's aim here is to remove all of the people who are currently in Gaza, to remove people from that area, to ensure that nobody is able to sustain continuing to live in that area at all. Is that correct? Is that part of the aim here?
I don't think that's accurate. There are certainly forces within Israeli politics who were enthused by President Trump's remarks about voluntary emigration from Gaza. They've concluded the levels of support for terrorism in Gaza are so high, there simply is no way that we can continue to live next to these people because it's a recipe for the next war. Personally, I put more hopes on the possibility of de-radicalization so we
Does it
can
worry you,
escape
though?
this cycle of
Does it
violence.
worry you that there are people within the Israeli government who think that? Because that's ethnic cleansing, isn't it?
I think that would not be my preferred solution for the Gaza Strip. I agree with what the Prime Minister said at the beginning of the war, the need for what he called the 3Ds, to demilitarize Gaza, to destroy Hamas, and de-radicalize Palestinian society. There needs to be an understanding of what drove people to celebrate in the streets when the hostages were dragged in on October 7th, and to make sure that doesn't happen again, just like Nazi Germany was denazified after the war.
But can you understand why people looking at this situation, looking at what is happening to Gazans, looking at what is happening to children, when they hear those remarks from Israeli politicians, can you understand why they have very, very little faith in the idea of a ceasefire? Because what they hear is the sense that what they get is the sense that there are Israeli politicians and maybe a sort of growing number who think the solution here is to remove everybody from that area. And as I say, that is ethnic cleansing.
I can hear why they would be very wary of the idea of continuing the war, but the purpose of the ceasefire is that the war ends. The war Hamas started nearly 2 years ago has been going on for too long. Hamas has been waging this guerrilla war from inside urban areas and bringing untold destruction on the people of Gaza. That needs to end. That's why Israel is hoping that Hamas can be pressured into accepting a temporary ceasefire that will open the gateway to a permanent ceasefire.
Okay.
And therefore, I think the statement you referred to earlier from the Foreign Secretary and other countries was deeply, deeply counterproductive and misguided, because it is encouraging Hamas to dig in its heels. When Hamas is not showing flexibility in the negotiations for a ceasefire right now, it looks and says Israel is the one under pressure. There's no reason for us to try to make accommodations. The UK, the France, Canada, they will bring Israel to heel. If we want a ceasefire, we need pressure on Hamas to accept the proposal that is on the table, the American Qatari proposal that Israel has already accepted. The negotiating team is in Doha waiting for Hamas to accept that proposal for a ceasefire.
So you're suggesting that this statement from the UK and 27 other nations helps Hamas?
I think this statement has made the prospect of a ransom deal and ceasefire less likely and is prolonging this war by encouraging Hamas to dig in its heels. Absolutely.
In that statement, these nations accuse Israel of drip-feeding aid to civilians in Gaza. One of the main concerns that those nations have is the scenes that they see at aid queues, at water distribution sites, where they see, and there are reports of, civilians being hit with bullets. There are, daily now, it seems, killing of children, women, other people who are queuing for food. That is unacceptable, isn't it?
Look, regardless of whether we accept Hamas's numbers, and personally I think we should be suspicious of Hamas's numbers, clearly the crowd control issues around the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation have not been successful. We have seen scenes of utter chaos, and that has not been implemented as it was meant to. I think what Israel was trying to achieve there is to create a necessary balance between the humanitarian needs of the population, which are severe, and Israel's security needs, which are to make sure that aid cannot reach Hamas. The problem with the previous mechanism is less that Hamas was diverting aid, is that it was able to tax the aid because it's the government of Gaza. That enabled it to refill its coffers and prolong this war by paying the fighters who are starving the hostages and still fighting out of hospitals and schools.
If your suggestion is that you don't want aid to get into the hands of Hamas fighters, why are you positioning aid distribution points? Why is Israel positioning aid distribution points close to military zones, where as Israel says, that's where Hamas fighters are? Why not move them away from those zones and open more aid distribution stations so you wouldn't see these repeated scenes?
Well, Gaza is one large military zone at the moment. There are areas that are under the control of the IDF and areas that are still under control of Hamas. And therefore, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an American organization, has set up those distribution centers in areas that have already been cleansed from Hamas control to try to make sure that Hamas cannot get its hands on aid. And I think that countries that rightfully are concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza and want to make sure that people get the aid should engage with Israel on creative ways to make sure aid gets to people who need it, make sure Hamas can't steal it. Because if we go back to a mechanism where Hamas can tax the aid that's reaching the markets and use it to finance its war machine,
what proof do you have that that's happening?
I mean, the images of Hamas gunmen sitting on top of aid trucks have been broadcast live on Sky News, and the UN has been quite clear it relies on.
Well, hold on a minute. That's what you've just told me is that Hamas taxed the aid and that's what you wanted to stop. But what's the proof of that?
Because Hamas is the government of Gaza. That's how governments work. They impose taxes
hang on,
on goods under their control.
Back up a moment. Where is the proof that that is happening?
If you would like statements from merchants in Gaza, I'm sure we can find them. But Hamas is the government of Gaza. It's not just a militia group. It has for 16 years been a one-party authoritarian regime inside Gaza. And the Wall Street Journal reported just a few months ago that Hamas was struggling to pay the salaries of its fighters because its money had dried up. And
I understand that. I understand
because
that.
it was no longer able to.
I understand that. But that's not the same thing. What I'm asking for here, and part of the problem, is that Israel won't allow journalists into Gaza. So there is no way to independently verify what's actually happening. It doesn't seem that you have proof that Hamas is taxing aid. There may well be lots of other things that are going on. Why will Israel not allow journalists into Gaza? Do you think it should at this point?
Again, I would refer you to the Wall Street Journal article that explained that Hamas is running low on money to pay its fighters because it's no longer able to tax the aid inside the markets. As for the question of journalists, first of all, there are Palestinian journalists inside Gaza. We're always being told that they are brave, that they are independent. And if that is true, then their word should be as good as a white journalist who's able to come in from another country and has no special advantage. The reason that Israel does not allow journalists into Gaza, and the Supreme Court has accepted this when a petition reached the court at the beginning of the war, is the fear of exposing troop movements inside Gaza. The most important thing for Israel is to keep its soldiers safe. We've already lost nearly 900 soldiers, and there is fear that cameramen with cameras on the roofs would expose troop positions and put them in danger. Personally, given the number of stories we've seen coming out of Gaza that later turned out to be either completely fabricated or at least inflated, I think Israel is paying a price for the decision not to let journalists into Gaza in order to keep its troops safe. But that is the reason, and as I said, was accepted by the Supreme Court when it was came up in a petition.
So is now the time to change that policy, in your opinion, do you think?
I think the military needs to make its own assessment of how to keep Israel's soldiers safe in the most fiendishly difficult urban battlefield the world has ever seen, where Hamas is fighting from inside and under civilian buildings and would, of course, try to use the international press as human shields like they've used so many other civilians as human shields.
Eylon Levy, the former Israeli government spokesperson, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Kate. Always a pleasure.